These are extremely volatile times, and we have in our region really mirrored the development that we've seen across Europe, indeed over the global economy over the last couple of years. When we met about a year ago in Vilnius, you see there the 2010 BDF summit, we were still recovering from the first phase of the global economic crisis. So Dalborg talked yesterday about the global crisis 1.0. Actually, at that time, there were some concerns that we might be recovering too fast. We were doing quite well. This region proved to be strong. There was a determined action by governments throughout the region to deal with the downfall that we experienced. We were all small, open economies. We were affected by the downturn in global trade, but our governments reacted and our economies returned to growth relatively quickly. Now see what happened since. Almost immediately after our summit, the growth, at least in sentiment, and shortly thereafter also in terms of economic output data, flattened. Right now we're facing again a very difficult economic environment. There are negative news largely from the outside, and I think a big topic for our conference, for our region will be how do we deal with this second challenge, with this new challenge that presumably will take longer than a couple of months to resolve, that might be with us for the next few years. Now, where do we stand in terms of the economic environment that we're facing right now? It is obvious that the economic conditions are indeed difficult. First round was very much about financial markets being in disarray. This round is much more about difficulties in public sector finances. It's true in the United States, it's true in Europe. What that means longer term is that we can't rely on demand-driven growth to put us forward. But I think one issue is very important, and that's a sentiment that I hear increasingly in many different countries in which I've had the chance to work over the last few months. The underlying problem is not economic, it's political. Doesn't mean that there are easy choices that our political leaders face that they are just afraid to take. These choices are hard. When we deal with the Greek debt crisis and the possibility of contagion across Europe, there are no risk-free or pain-free solutions. But it's also clear that without decisions being taken, the economic costs will be much higher than they would otherwise be. So we'll have to brace ourselves for these difficult decisions, for these harsh decisions, for these costly decisions to be taken. Essentially, there are only three choices that we have in order to deal with the current situation in Europe. Either we bail out, government by government, those countries that have spent too much, or we let go them bust, and we bail out the banks that will be affected by the fallout of the default. Or we'll hope for the European Central Bank to basically run up inflation so that the debt disappears. None of these options is particularly attractive. But at least economists haven't come up with any better solution. The question is, what is the mix out of these three that we can agree on and then move forward? The economies will recover. In the US, I think the latest economic data already is much more positive. I'm confident that Europe could do the same if we take the right kind of decisions and just face the realities as they are. Now, what does that mean for the Baltic Sea region? Well, in the past, we often talked a lot about how us as small open economies, how we are affected by what's happening around us. How the global economy, how the European economy is pushing us ahead or holding us back. The reality is that we're not going to we will not be able to count on support from outside to kind of get our economies going. The only way that the Baltic Sea region is going to be able to create growth is by factors internally to the region. Now, the firepower that we used in the first phase of the crisis in terms of public spending and lenient monetary policy is basically used up. So what we can do, what we can try to do, is really focus on competitiveness, trying to make sure that the underlying productivity of our region is increased. And that, again, I think is another good topic for us to discuss as we meet here in Gdansk and think about how to move this region forward. Now, where do we currently stand? We are still a very prosperous region. You know, we're somewhere below the average of these regions here, but these are mostly very prosperous regions of Europe and other parts of the world. We have a pretty good balance in terms of labor productivity and labor mobilization. In fact, our region has done particularly well in mobilizing the labor market, the resources that we have in our labor markets. And that's one of the key reasons that we've come through the crisis better than many others. We've been able to keep employment levels relatively high. And with employment levels relatively high, domestic consumption has held up much better than in other countries. But this comparison also shows a maybe surprising challenge that we continue to face. Our productivity level is very high in some parts of the region, but it's also quite low in other parts of the region. These numbers are largely affected by the parts of northwestern Russia, but also Poland and the Baltic countries that are here because of the number of people that are there. So there is potential to grow. There is potential to catch up. There is potential to move this region forward without relying on external demand alone pushing us forward. Now, this year in the report, two of my colleagues from Stockholm, Gunnar Eliasson and Pontus Braunehjelm, talk a little bit about the role of entrepreneurship in actually helping us unlock the potential of higher productivity in this region. What they point out is that productivity growth at the firm level can be driven by three different elements. First is entry and exit either through FDI, so companies coming from the outside, or new companies entering the local markets. And the third one is changes within companies, companies themselves becoming more efficient, more productive. Now, what we've seen in our region is that in the Baltic countries and in Poland, FDI has played quite an important role. So old, inefficient companies were replaced by foreign companies that had better management techniques, better capital, and that drove up productivity growth. Now, that's a very powerful driver, but we also know that that's a driver that eventually loses steam. In the northwest of our region, Germany and the Nordics, the focus has been much more on increasing efficiency within companies. We've seen significant efforts over the last couple of years of companies focusing on innovation, becoming more efficient, downsizing often, reducing their operations while increasing more value for their customers. What we haven't seen enough, both in the Nordics, in Germany, and in the Baltics, Poland, Western Russia, is the bottom green arrow. How can we unlock the power of entrepreneurship? This will be a crucial challenge if we want to move ahead and really have dynamic productivity growth in this region. This is a bit more the longer-term outlook. Now let's look at the more direct indicators of how this region has been doing over the last year in response to the crisis. So the lines that you see here is a market share analysis always of where the region stands in terms of global world export market shares. We are a very open economy, so the share of exports that we have on the world market is higher than our overall share in terms of GDP of the world economy. That continues to be the case. But what you see here is that this line goes down. It has gone down through the crisis. The first observation was that, well, maybe we're just particularly hard hit by the global breakdown in trade volumes. But it turns out that even in 2010, as global trade recovered, our region has continued to lose world market share. This is a serious issue. We need to understand why that is happening. Is that a sign that our competitiveness is waning, or is that a sign that maybe the structure of the global economy is changing and we have to adjust to continue to support and earn our high standards of living in our region? Now, if we look at FDI, there is an indication that maybe it's not because our competitiveness has been eroding, but because the changes in the global economy lead to a different pattern of value creation. So these lines, the blue one is for outward FDI, the smaller lines are for flows, the thicker ones are for stocks. But here we look at what is our position in foreign direct investment flows. Our companies investing abroad, companies from abroad investing in our region. And what you see here, FDI flows are often much more volatile, but what you see is that here our region has held up much better. So we are a strong investor in global markets. We are still attractive for foreign capital to come in because we have knowledge assets that are there, but we have been losing world market share. In fact, if you compare these, and my economist friends will be a little bit skeptic about this picture because trade is flows and FDI is stocks. But what we see is that the global economy is changing from a model where competitive location essentially produces a lot of stuff at home and exports it to global markets. We're moving to a situation where competitiveness leads you to invest in foreign markets and basically project your competitiveness, the strength of your companies, to produce elsewhere. The challenge is that value generation in terms of jobs and wages moves with it. So we continue to have headquarters, we continue to have a lot of R&D in our region, but a lot of production has moved away and the jobs and value creation with it. Now these are not the top high-paying jobs, but they are jobs, all right. They're important jobs, and we need to think about how we adjust our economic structures in order to make sure that in this new global economy, we continue to be able to support a high standard of living. This means we need to focus more on our local industries. How do we improve productivity and service and things that focus on our local markets? It means that we need to focus on things that help us to retain a larger part of production, although we are smaller markets that by themselves cannot support the large manufacturing productivity that, for example, China or even larger markets like Germany and to some degree Poland can afford as you look at those markets. Now at the bottom of this is really what we call competitiveness for this report, which really means, what are the fundamental factors that affect how able are we to mobilize our labor forces and how able are we to, once these people are in jobs, to allow them to be really productive and innovative and earn a high wage in global competition. What we see again in this report is that our region is a very competitive place. We have a number of countries that are among the top attractive places to do business in the world. We also have others that have still much work to do, but basically our position has been quite stable and is overall in line with the level of prosperity that we've earned. This year we've also looked a little bit more at policy, and what we see is that there is a range of activity, almost in every area of competitiveness upgrading that you can imagine. So we're not standing still. Our governments are working hard to try to upgrade competitiveness. Now what we do see is that the track records across countries is quite different. And I think there are indications that those countries that have an inherently coherent strategy, that know exactly what is important and what is kind of nice to have, do much better. So let me pick one example, which is Sweden, where I happen to live at the moment. I don't agree necessarily with all elements of the Swedish economic strategy, but it's inherently very coherent. Solid macroeconomic policy. Over the last couple of years, policies that try to mobilize the labor market in order to finance the welfare system and keep things going, and then kind of broad investments in the infrastructure and innovation system to hope that productivity growth will work on its own. Another example is Estonia. Again, I think a lot of things that could be done better, but a very strong focus on open markets, lean governments, and that has helped them to kind of prioritize better their decisions. There is still a lot of work to do across our region to enhance the level of strategy in terms of economic policy. Focusing on what's important, setting clear priorities, sequencing what to do, not just executing on the European 2020 strategy, which I think gives a useful framework, but the strategy decisions have to be done at home. They can only benefit and draw on what has been done in Europe. Now let's look at one example in a little bit more detail, and we're lucky in the reports, and I invite you to look at that. We have one distinguished Polish economist writing about the Polish experience over the last couple of years. As many of you know, Poland was the only country that managed to go through the crisis without negative growth rates. So the question is why? Is there much to learn? And I think what we see is actually that this is an interesting lesson. Poland has much to be proud of. But Poland also has huge opportunities to improve its productivity much more. Part of the reason that this economy has done well is that it was less integrated in global trade. than many of its peers, especially many of the other Central European countries. Part of the reason that this economy has done better is that its financial system was less developed than in many other countries. So it was less susceptible to the shock to the financial system that was there. And what we've seen, and what my Polish colleague describes very well, is how public investment, including in the infrastructure that you might have seen on the road from the airport, has replaced for a time private consumption, and that the domestic power of growth continues to be strong. This can continue to happen in Poland, but it will require them to address some of the hard red areas that are there that need to be addressed in order to allow companies to become more productive in this region. Now, one of the questions is, how can we use regional cooperation in order to make this happen? We've had over the years many institutions, many projects, many networks that have tried to work together in the Baltic Sea region to make this happen. Now, over the last 2 years, we had the EU Baltic Sea region as an attempt to become more strategic, to prioritize and organize a little bit more. What we see again this year, and we have 3 examples about flagship projects in the report, is that we have a significant increase in coordination across these projects, across the strategic agendas of our initiatives, our organizations, and even in part in terms of the financing instruments that are there. I think this is a huge achievement, and quite frankly, much more than I would have expected 2 or 3 years ago. Where are the challenges? Well, one challenge is are we really able to do more than just coordinate better what we have been doing in the past? And I think there still is room to work on. One example is the integration of markets. We have projects that tackle that, but they are not as aggressive as would be necessary to really make a huge impact. The second one, and that was the topic yesterday, is how do we involve the private sector much more? I think that hasn't really worked to the sufficient degree as we would have liked it to see. Why is that? I think it fundamentally goes back to decisions that were taken before the strategy was implemented. And 2 of the mantras were no new institutions, no new money. Now, I don't think we need a new bureaucracy. I am also not convinced that we need a new budget line. But the reality is, under these conditions, you only move out of the kind of confines of how you've operated in the past if political leaders from the top make those decisions. Now, they have been occupied with a lot of other things, and you can't expect them to always put Baltic Sea region cooperation first. So I think we've created a system that is too fragile to move ahead on its own. Now, let me just make some suggestions on how we could move forward. One is, let's think about a Baltic Sea Competitiveness Council. Such a council could bring together private sector leaders and public sector leaders. It doesn't need a large bureaucracy, but what we need is a high-level platform that allows us to set the strategic agenda. Not force it on Brussels, not force it on somebody else, but really try to create a structure where we not rely on prime ministers and presidents to be there to make the hard decisions that are there. I think we're ripe for making that step. Second practical idea. What about not just having our national reform programs in the context of the 2020 strategy, but have an integrated strategy for the overall region? I think we could do much more. We could mobilize and go across regional cooperation to involve other policy areas as well. There is nothing in the current structure that is a real barrier against it. It just depends on our will. And the third one is, why don't we create much more funds in terms of innovation where we pool our resources to really create a joint market, let's say in knowledge, let's say in innovation activities. The Nordic countries have stepped forward and made some interesting experiments in that area. I think we as a region can do much more and use those ideas further. Let me just step on that and go right to the end. What's ahead for the Baltic Sea region? The reality is, the next few years are going to be difficult. There is not going to be any help from the outside world. We have to rely on our own, but the good news is I think we're well capable and there is the potential to move ahead. We just have to be willing to kind of step out of the kind of confines of what we're used to. The instruments are there, the EU Baltic Sea region strategy is there, our organizations are aligned. Now it's just our decision to really take those leadership choices and make the next step forward. Thank you.